Hello, listeners. This is Deep Dive, a broadcast that deeply explores the truth. Today, following our fourth broadcast, is the fifth in our planned 10-part series. Today, we will embark on a deep exploration of truth with you, our listeners, once again.
Yeah, and we are so glad you're joining us for this because today we're looking at the Bible, but, and I really want to stress this, we aren't looking at it as just, some emotional collection of random feel-good quotes.
We're absolutely not.
We are going to look at how a brutal Roman execution method and like this really obscure ancient law were essentially weaponized. They were used to frame an innocent man. And then we'll see how that exact frame-up was actually, well, the most brilliant legal transaction in all of human history.
I mean, that is just the perfect framework for what we are tackling today, because to truly grasp what the biblical text is doing, we have to recognize the actual nature of the text itself,
Yeah, the rules of it.
Exactly. Human language is the tool God chose to communicate with us, and it isn't arbitrary. It has fundamental objective rules. It relies on structure, on grammar, and historical context.
Right.
And the Holy Spirit utilized these incredibly specific rules of language to document this event for us.
Which means, for our listeners, we can't just treat the text like a buffet.
Oh, definitely not.
There's this huge tendency today to just pluck out words or single verses that make us feel warm and fuzzy, right? While completely ignoring the surrounding context.
It happens all the time.
But the reality is the moment we isolate a phrase just because it appeals to our emotions, we step completely away from the truth of the text. We just end up with a God of our own imagination rather than the God who actually speaks through the full architecture of the Bible.
And that does a massive disservice to the listener and, frankly, to the text itself. So our goal today is to observe the specific, deliberate clues God left in the biblical text. We want to understand the overarching logic, the larger blueprint that connects these historical events, because every detail from the political climate of the first century to the specific ancient laws invoked, it all matters immensely.
It really does. So let's pick up exactly where we left off in our previous broadcast.
Yeah.
Because we uncovered something that honestly completely shifted the paradigm for me.
It was a heavy realization for sure.
It was. We established that Jesus' death on the cross wasn't merely about the agonizing physical pain. I mean, obviously, the physical reality of Roman crucifixion is horrific.
The nails, the suffocation.
Right,
Yeah.
it's brutal.
Right.
But the true, horrifying core of his death was the absolute profound agony of being utterly forsaken by God.
Yeah, and that realization changes our entire understanding of the event. And it really forces us to ask the central questions for our deep dive today.
The big why questions.
Exactly. Why? Why did the Messiah have to endure a death where he was totally abandoned by God? Why was he so utterly terrified in the garden beforehand, sweating blood in anticipation? And why was he crying out in unmatched agony on the cross, experiencing a level of suffering that goes far, far beyond just physical torture?
Okay, let's unpack this. But I think to get to the why behind that divine abandonment, we actually have to start with the how.
Right, the mechanics of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, how did Jesus even end up on a Roman cross to begin with, especially when the text explicitly tells us that the presiding judge in his trial knew he was completely innocent?
It is a wild contradiction. To understand that, we need to reconstruct the historical stage presented in our broadcast materials.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So, in the first century, Israel was not a sovereign nation. They were a subjugated people living under the absolute iron-fisted rule of the Roman Empire.
Right.
And the local governance in Judea was handled by a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate. Now, Rome didn't maintain its sprawling empire just through friendly diplomacy.
Definitely not.
They maintained it through sheer force and the psychology of terror.
And crucifixion was basically the ultimate tool in that psychological arsenal, right? It wasn't just used for everyday crimes like petty theft.
Not at all. It was an extreme penalty reserved strictly for subjugated peoples, rebellious slaves, and terrorists against the state.
Wow.
It was a public spectacle designed to strip away every ounce of human dignity. It was Rome's way of erecting a billboard of flesh and blood to say to the local population, hey, this is what happens when you challenge the authority of Caesar.
So we have Jesus arrested and brought before this Roman governor. But when you actually read the New Testament text, comparing the accounts across Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's this glaring, almost absurd contradiction in how the trial actually plays out.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Pontius Pilate, the representative of this ruthless empire, he repeatedly examines Jesus, declares him entirely innocent of any capital crime, and explicitly states out loud his desire to release him.
Yeah, the text is very clear on Pilate's assessment. He finds no fault in him whatsoever.
But if Pilate had the entire Roman military apparatus at his disposal, and he knew the man was innocent, why did he cave to a local mob? How does an innocent man still get executed by the state's most horrific method? That's the missing piece for me.
Right, and it comes down to the intense political blackmail orchestrated by the Jewish religious leaders. The text shows us that these leaders, the Sanhedrin, the high priests, they were master manipulators.
Okay.
They whipped the local crowd into a frenzy, sure, but more importantly, they cornered Pilate politically.
How do you corner a Roman governor, though? He has all the army.
By threatening his standing with Rome, the leaders essentially told Pilate, if you let this man go, a man who claims to be a king, you are no friend of Caesar.
Oh, wow, that's a direct threat.
Exactly. In the political climate of the Roman Empire, a governor whose territory breaks out into a massive riot over a supposed rival king is a governor who gets recalled to Rome and likely executed for treason or just sheer incompetence.
So they forced his hand?
Yeah, they backed the most powerful man in the region into a corner where his own survival literally required Jesus' death.
Okay, that makes sense. That explains the political leverage. But it raises a much bigger question for me. Why were these religious leaders so unbelievably desperate to get rid of Jesus in the first place? Like, what was driving this level of venom?
Well, the underlying motive, which is clearly laid out in the text, is that Jesus had become a massive existential threat to their power and authority. For years, he had been publicly exposing these religious leaders for distorting the Old Testament, creating man-made rules, and entirely misleading the population. He called out their hypocrisy right in the temple courts.
Right, and the people were starting to realize that their leaders were corrupt.
Exactly. But our broadcast materials point to one specific event as the final catalyst. The real tipping point wasn't just a fiery sermon. It was the raising of Lazarus.
Ah, yes. The text in the Gospel of John details this miracle that simply could not be explained away or, swept under the rug.
No, it couldn't, because Lazarus wasn't just unconscious or sick. He had been dead for 4 days.
Yeah.
The biblical text includes a very specific, grim detail. His body had already started to smell.
That detail is so raw, but it's crucial because it establishes the undeniable biological reality of death and decomposition.
Exactly. It removes any possibility of a swoon theory or a medical mistake. Lazarus was entirely, demonstrably dead, and Jesus raised him back to life right in front of a multitude of witnesses.
And the timing and location are critical here, right? Because this wasn't happening in some remote village in secret.
No, not at all.
We were talking about massive crowds gathering near Jerusalem right before the Passover, which is one of the most significant religious festivals. People were flocking to see Jesus, but the text says they were also coming just to stare at Lazarus. Like, they literally wanted to see the dead man who was having dinner.
Right. The momentum among the Jewish public was absolutely unstoppable at that point. The crowds were ready to crown Jesus as the promised Messiah right then and there. And for the corrupt religious leaders, this was a total catastrophe. The sheer number of witnesses and the undeniable proof of the miracle made it impossible for them to just quietly assassinate Jesus.
Wait a minute. Let me stop you there, because the psychology of this is just staggering to me. If these religious leaders literally watched a dead man walk out of a tomb, a man who smelled of decaying flesh 4 days prior, how could they possibly double down and plot a murder against the person who performed that miracle?
It's hard to wrap your head around.
Logically, wouldn't you fall on your knees and say, okay, clearly God is with this guy?
You would certainly think so. But it profoundly illustrates the blindness that comes when human power, pride, and established authority are threatened. They were not actively seeking the truth of God.
Right.
They were desperately protecting their own societal status, their wealth, and their control over the people. When the truth threatened their empire, they chose to try and kill the truth.
Man, it makes me think of a massive modern-day corporate scandal.
Oh, how so?
Imagine a deeply corrupt board of directors at, like, a global multi-billion-dollar company. They've been embezzling funds and ruining lives for decades. And then suddenly, a whistleblower emerges from within the company.
Okay, I see where you're going.
And this whistleblower doesn't just have vague allegations. They have absolute, undeniable, hard drive proof of the corruption. And this person is scheduled to go on national television to expose the entire board to the world.
The board of directors would be in a state of absolute panic.
Right. But in that panic, The corrupt board realizes that simply firing the whistleblower isn't enough. Even if they fire them, or even if they somehow have them quietly killed in a hit and run, the public might still believe the whistleblower's initial claims. The data is still out there.
Yes, the truth is already leaking.
No, the board needs the whistleblower totally discredited in the court of public opinion.
They need a public undoing.
Exactly. They need to frame the whistleblower. They need to plant fabricated evidence of a heinous crime on the whistleblower's computer, orchestrate a highly publicized police raid, and have them dragged out in handcuffs on the evening news.
Right.
They need to completely ruin this person's reputation so that when the public looks at them, they feel disgust rather than trust. And the religious leaders, they didn't just need Jesus dead. A quiet assassination would have turned him into a martyr, and the people would have revolted. They needed his reputation and his claim to being the Messiah completely destroyed.
That is a phenomenal way to understand their strategy, and it perfectly explains why they couldn't just stone him to death themselves, which was the traditional Jewish method of execution for blasphemy.
Oh, yeah.
They needed a very specific type of death to completely shatter his reputation among the Jewish people.
So how do you publicly undo a Messiah in first century Judea?
You weaponize the biblical text against him. And here is where we must observe the specific clues in the Old Testament. The religious leaders used a foundational law to construct their trap. Specifically, they looked to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, verses 22 and 23.
And for our listeners, Deuteronomy is part of the Torah, the law. This isn't just a book of good advice or suggestions. This is the absolute foundational legal and theological bedrock for the Jewish people.
It is the absolute authority. And according to this specific law in Deuteronomy, if a man committed a crime punishable by death and he was executed and his body was hung on a tree, that hanging body defiled the land.
Okay.
But more importantly, the text explicitly states that anyone hung on a tree is cursed by God.
Cursed by God, not just punished by the state, but actively spiritually cursed by the Creator.
Yes. To a first-century Jewish person, seeing someone hung on a wooden beam on a tree was a massive, non-negotiable cultural and theological reflex. It was a visual trigger button.
A trigger button.
Yeah. The moment a Jewish person saw that, their immediate, ingrained biblical conclusion based on the Torah was, that person is actively cursed by God.
Wow. So we really start to see the calculated, sinister brilliance of this plot. If the religious leaders could somehow force the Romans to execute Jesus, using their specific method of crucifixion, hanging him on a wooden cross, it would serve as definitive biblical proof to the entire Jewish crowd that Jesus was a fraud.
Exactly. They were manipulating the objective text of the Bible to turn the people against the author of the Bible.
Think about the psychological impact on the crowd. They would look up at the cross, and their minds would immediately snap to Deuteronomy 21.
Instantly.
They would think, wait, we were so close to crowning him. We really thought he was the promised Messiah who would save us. But look at him. He's hanging on a tree. God's own law in Deuteronomy says anyone hung on a tree is cursed by God. God is actively cursing this man right in front of our eyes. He can't be the Messiah. He was just a con artist all along.
The wickedness of using God's own law to condemn God's own son is almost incomprehensible. It is a staggering level of manipulation.
That's completely incomprehensible. It really is. It's like buying what you think is a high-end luxury smartphone. You save up for it, you love it, you think it's the real deal. But then an expert opens it up, points to a specific super cheap battery inside and says, see this? This proves it's a counterfeit.
That's a great way to picture it.
Deuteronomy 21 was the counterfeit stamp the leaders used to trick the public. They pointed to the wooden cross and essentially said to the public, see this tree, see this curse, this proves he is a counterfeit Messiah.
What's fascinating here is how this sinister human plot was actually part of a divine mechanism. Because if we look at the whole architecture of the biblical text, we uncover something breathtaking. The religious leaders thought they had brilliantly weaponized the Old Testament to destroy Jesus once and for all. But God was actually using their wicked, politically motivated plot to fulfill his ultimate promise.
And God doesn't just ignore the rule from Deuteronomy, right? He doesn't say, well, it's a false charge, so the curse doesn't apply. He leans entirely into the mechanism of the law.
He fulfills it with absolute precision. To understand this divine mechanism, our broadcast materials point us to a crucial New Testament text that connects all the dots. The book of Galatians, chapter 3, verse 13.
Okay, what does the text in Galatians reveal about this situation?
The Apostle Paul, writing in Galatians, confirms a terrifying reality. He states that Jesus did indeed die a death that was actively cursed by God on that tree.
Wow.
The religious leaders were actually right about the mechanics of the law. The man hanging on the tree was facing the literal pouring out of the curse of God, fulfilling the exact wording of Deuteronomy 21.
Wait, let me stop you because that sounds like a contradiction. God was actively cursing Jesus. But the law requires the guilty person to be cursed. Jesus lived a life of absolute perfection. He was completely innocent. The curse shouldn't legally stick to him.
And you've just hit on the massive universe-altering twist that Galatians reveals. Because Jesus was the sinless, flawless Son of God, he did not deserve any curse whatsoever. According to the law, he was completely innocent. Therefore, the curse he absorbed on that cross wasn't his own.
It was a transfer?
Yes, it was our curse. He was legally taking the exact penalty, the precise curse that all of humanity, you, me, every single listener tuning in, rightly deserved. Because we are the ones who constantly fall short of God's perfect standard, which is the law.
This brings us to terms like redemption and ransom and substitutionary atonement. And I want to pause here because these are heavy academic terms. In a lot of modern contexts, people treat words like redemption as vague metaphors for love or just like self-improvement.
Right, they soften it.
But based on the author's logic in the biblical text, we aren't talking about metaphors, are we?
Not at all. If we trace the logic of the text, the terms redemption and ransom are strict transactional legal terms. They are not vague expressions of affection. They mean paying the exact, demanding price required by the law to rescue someone from a legal penalty.
So it's a court of law, not a romantic poetry reading.
Precisely. God's law is perfect and entirely just. When a law is broken, a penalty must be paid. A truly just judge cannot simply sweep crimes under the rug and say, oh, don't worry about it.
That would be justice.
Exactly. The ransom is the exact, unyielding price demanded by justice to free us from the penalty of our sins. Jesus was stepping in to legally swap places with us.
When you actually run the math on what the text is claiming here, the gravity of this trade-off is almost too heavy to articulate. But let me try to put it into a modern, everyday perspective so our listeners can really grasp the sheer weight of this transaction.
Please do. I think a modern context is essential here.
Okay, think of it like a catastrophic medical emergency. Imagine you fall terribly ill and you are rushed to the best hospital in the world. You undergo a massive, highly complex, life-saving surgery that takes teams of specialists weeks to perform.
Okay.
You survive, you are completely healed. But a month later, the hospital administration hands you the bill. You open the envelope, and the bill isn't just expensive, it is for billions of dollars.
A sum that is mathematically impossible for a normal person to pay.
Completely unpayable. You could work for 1,000 lifetimes, grinding day and night without spending a single dime on anything else, and you would never even make a dent in the accumulating interest, let alone the principal amount.
Wow.
And in this scenario, the law of the land is unforgiving. The law states that if you cannot pay your debts, you are legally bound to go to a maximum security debtor's prison until the debt is paid in full. Because the debt is unpayable, it means a guaranteed eternal sentence. You are going to prison forever.
The law is clear, the debt is undeniable, and the punishment is absolute.
Right. So picture yourself standing in the courtroom. The judge is looking down at you, the gavel is raised and about to fall, and your eternal sentence is about to begin.
Yeah.
You are completely helpless. But then the doors at the back of the courtroom open. An innocent person, someone who owes absolutely nothing to anyone, who possesses boundless, infinite wealth, steps into the room. This person walks right up to the judge, takes your multi-billion-dollar bill, and pays the entire thing out of their own account, down to the very last cent. The debt is zeroed out.
The legal requirement has been satisfied?
But it goes even further. This innocent person then looks at the judge and says, I will also take the physical sentence. They willingly walk into the maximum security cell, allowing the heavy iron doors to lock behind them so that you can walk out of the courtroom completely free. You don't owe a dime, and you don't serve a second of prison time.
That is a brilliant illustration of substitution, and it represents the exact logic of the cross. Jesus didn't just feel empathy for our situation from a distance. He stepped into the courtroom, legally and transactionally paid the unpayable bill, and absorbed the sentence himself.
But the scale of that debt is what makes this so sobering. Once we understand the sheer incomprehensible size of that hospital bill, we can finally begin to understand the emotional and spiritual agony we discussed earlier.
Yes.
We can finally understand why Jesus was so utterly terrified in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating drops of blood.
Because He was looking at the bill. He knew exactly what it was going to cost him to pay it.
He wasn't afraid of the Roman soldiers. He was afraid of the receipt.
Exactly. Let's deeply analyze the price that was paid based strictly on our broadcast materials and the biblical text. The cost wasn't just a few hours of physical torture inflicted by the Romans. If that were the case, as horrific as crucifixion is, it wouldn't explain his unique terror. Many martyrs throughout history have faced terrible physical deaths with stoic bravery, singing songs as they were executed. No, the terror Jesus faced was infinitely worse than physical pain.
And we have to be very careful not to minimize this, because there is a trend in modern thought to soften the realities of the text. Some people want to say, well, the suffering was just a feeling of spiritual sadness or a temporary sense of loneliness, or that hell is just being separated from God.
The text demands we look at the reality head on. To quantify the curse that Jesus absorbed on that cross, you cannot just look at the nails in the wood. You have to add up the eternal judgment, the unending screams, and the endless, conscious, excruciating agony in literal hell that every single human being was legally destined to endure.
Wow. We're talking about literal, devastating divine wrath. The active, terrifying, consuming justice of a perfectly holy God against all human evil, rebellion, arrogance, and sin throughout all of time.
Yes. Think about the cumulative weight of that. Every lie ever told, every murder ever committed, every theft, every act of cruelty, every hidden abuse, every ounce of selfishness committed by billions of human beings across millennia.
It's unbearable.
The listener, their friends, their family, you, me. The penalty for that vast, unfathomable ocean of sin is eternal, conscious judgment in hell. Because God is perfectly just, that massive infinite penalty could not simply be waived or dismissed. Justice demanded it be paid in full.
And on the cross, Jesus absorbed all of it. The infinite wrath of God that was meant to be distributed across billions of people for eternity was compressed and poured out entirely onto him all at once in those hours on the cross.
When the biblical text records that the sky went entirely dark in the middle of the day, that wasn't just a weather anomaly.
No.
That was the visual representation of the divine courtroom enacting the sentence. God the Father poured out the unmitigated fury of hell upon God the Son. And it was in the midst of this unimaginable, crushing weight of infinite judgment that Jesus cried out.
My God, why have you forsaken me?
That cry from the cross is so often misunderstood. People sometimes read it as a moment of weakness or a temporary loss of faith by a dying man. But when you follow the objective rules of the text and the mechanics we've uncovered today, it was neither of those things. It was the actual agonizing objective reality of taking our eternal curse.
He wasn't just feeling lonely. He was literally forsaken.
The fellowship of the Godhead, the profound eternal unity between the Father and the Son, experienced a tearing as Jesus became the literal object of divine wrath in our place. He was treated as if he had committed every sin in human history.
And here's the most chilling, profound realization we could draw from the text. When you really think about the mechanics of this transaction, that horrific, desperate cry of total abandonment, that was the exact scream that you and I were legally bound to scream for all eternity.
It was the exact penalty.
That scream was my scream. That scream belonged to our listeners.
He screamed it so that you wouldn't have to. He endured the exact measure of hell so that the listener, if they accept this ransom, would never have to experience a single drop of it.
So what does this all mean for how we read the Bible? When you observe the text this closely, it completely shatters the popular modern idea that the Bible is just a book of ancient moralistic fables teaching us how to be nice people.
It shifts the entire narrative. It proves that the Bible is a terrifyingly precise, deeply personal rescue mission documented in human history. A rescue mission executed with flawless legal and theological architecture.
Because without this specific mechanism, the perfect, sinless Son stepping in to take the precise curse demanded by the law to pay an infinite debt, no human being could ever survive God's standard of justice. We would all be left standing in that courtroom, holding that unpayable billions of dollars hospital bill, facing eternity in the prison of hell.
Exactly. And if we connect this back to our primary mission for this deep dive, we see how God used the language, the grammar, and the exact rules of the biblical text to reveal this truth. From the strict law regarding a hanging body in Deuteronomy, which was manipulated by corrupt, power-hungry leaders, to the stunning fulfillment and reversal explained by Paul in Galatians.
Yeah.
The text is an unbreakable chain of truth. God didn't just write a story. He orchestrated history and documented it with objective clues for us to follow.
It's just breathtaking when you see the big picture. To summarize our journey today, We've seen that the cross was absolutely not an accident. It wasn't a tragedy where a good moral teacher got caught up in corrupt local politics and had a string of bad luck.
Right.
It was a calculated divine blueprint. It was Jesus, the promised Messiah, purposefully stepping into the courtroom of human history, taking the counterfeit stamp of the curse from Deuteronomy, absorbing the eternal wrath and judgment meant for us, and paying our unpayable debt in full so we could escape the eternal consequences we actually deserved.
It is the ultimate act of legally satisfying the wrath of God. However, this raises an incredibly important question, which sets the stage for our next broadcast.
Right, because we can't just leave the story at the burial. If the story ends there, it's a defeat.
Think about the crowds watching that day. To the Jewish people standing at the foot of the cross, and even to his own disciples, Jesus still looked exactly like a cursed fraud. He died hanging on a tree, fulfilling the physical requirements of the curse in Deuteronomy. His dead body was taken down and placed in a stone tomb. To the Roman Empire, it was just another execution. To the corrupt religious leaders, they had won. The public ruin was complete and the movement was dead.
From a human perspective, the whistleblower was silenced and the smear campaign was a total success.
So if Jesus actually paid the invisible, infinite spiritual debt, how did God prove to the world that Jesus wasn't just a cursed criminal? How did God validate historically and publicly that the massive debt had actually been paid in full and that Jesus was the true Messiah? That question leads us directly to the most important paradigm-shifting event in human history, the resurrection.
And that is exactly what we will be deeply exploring in part 6 of our series. We're going to look at the objective, textual clues surrounding the empty tomb. You will not want to miss how the resurrection acts as the final, undeniable receipt for the debt that was paid on the cross.
It is the ultimate vindication of everything we've analyzed in the text today.
As we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you, our listeners, with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something to carry with you this week as you go about your life. Next time you see a cross, whether it's on top of a building as you drive by, worn as a piece of jewelry, or referenced in a book or a movie, I want you to really look at it through the lens of the objective biblical text.
Yeah, look closely at it.
Ask yourself, are you just seeing a tragic symbol of a good teacher who was misunderstood and crushed by a cruel world? Or are you looking at the exact, terrifyingly heavy receipt of your own personal, unpayable debt, permanently stamped, paid in full?
A profound question, and one that the biblical text demands we answer.
We warmly wish all of our listeners and your loved ones a safe journey in truth this week. Thank you for joining us as we observe, analyze, and uncover the grand architecture of the text. Until next time, this concludes today's session of Deep Dive. Take care.